Let it go, make my body go, make our bodies higher and higher.
We're looking at the worksheet fonts in the workbook 04-formatting. If you click on a cell, on the Home tab you can see what font is being used. The standard font in Excel is called Calibri, as it has been for the last few versions of Excel, and the standard size is 11. At different times you might want to consider changing these. If we want to make these numbers stand out a little bit more strongly, we could possibly use a larger size, make that be 12. Or, instead of that, as I press Ctrl-Z to undo, we could consider some other options in the font group here on the Home tab. Make them bold, italic, underline, any two, any one, any combination of those as desired. All of these are what we call toggle buttons. They're on-off. Click them once to apply the feature, again to remove the feature. Different times we can easily get to these. Sometimes we want to change the actual font type. Now, in older versions of Excel, the standard font was called Arial, size 10. Off to the right, although not of huge importance, you can see a comparison of the two. Calibri 11, the current standard, Arial 10, pretty much the same, although you will see at different times a difference, like between the numbers 7, the way they're depicted, the dollar sign, slight difference there. Sometimes you're looking at a worksheet, it might look a little strange to you or funny. Maybe it's Arial size 10 instead of Calibri 11, or vice versa. It's what you're used to that counts. There will be times too when you want to change the actual font, for example on a title. So I'm clicking on this merge cell that appears across the top of the worksheet here. On the Home tab next to Candera is a drop arrow, and I can slide over some other choices here as well. If you're an indecisive person, well, you're going to have a tough time out here deciding on which one works best. Do notice that the font size varies with some of these different choices. Some of the fonts you'll want to use a larger number or a smaller number for the actual font size here. So lots of choices there too. And at different times you might want to consider some other possibilities here that are not available in this font group. You can click the little arrow to the right. It's called a dialog box launcher. Click that. You can also get here by way of Control-1, although it doesn't always take you to the font tab. But once here you can also see we've got some font choices available for strike-through. If you need to use superscript or subscript, you'll see those here. And possibly you could come here to apply a number of different features at the same time. So you could be applying bold and the font type itself and the size and a few other features all at once if you wish. If you simply want to change the font color, maybe you want the color here to be different, I'd strongly advise against using red. If you click the drop arrow here, using red sometimes for a lot of people working with numbers think those are negative, so stay away from red. Dark blue might work just fine here, maybe bold, although certainly not necessary. So lots of different capabilities here for working with different font choices, primarily from the menu, occasionally from that dialog box that you can get to from the corner. You can easily adjust the width of columns and the height of rows. And as we look at this worksheet called Rows and Columns, in the workbook called 04 Formatting, maybe we want to make sure that these columns here, B, C, D, E, F, and G, are all exactly the same width. Much of the time, when you adjust column widths and or row heights, you need not go into the menu system. You can simply use the boundaries between columns or the ones between row numbers to make adjustments. Now, two possibilities here. If we want all these monthly columns to be wider, since we've dragged across to select them, we can point to any boundary between the column letters, click and drag. Notice as we do this, we see the number of pixels above it. Now, most of the time we don't really care, but sometimes you might. I'll make these 75. Main idea is I want them of a certain width and I want them all to be the same. So if I were to click right here on the boundary between F and G, holding down the mouse, it's 75 pixels. And over here between B and C, same thing. Now, it could be that these numbers vary a little bit. Do we want column H to be the same? We could possibly make it be the same. We could just click here and it is 75 already, but we could possibly make that wider. Or what if we wanted these to be just as wide as they need to be? By double-clicking, you activate a feature called Best Fit. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the same width. In fact, as we look at them, it looks like February might be wider than January. Why is that? numbers aren't any wider, but February takes up more horizontal space than January. What I'm getting at here, without getting too picky, is the idea that at different times we have different needs. You can click and drag to make any column wider. If you've got multiple columns selected, you're going to make that happen on multiple columns. If I want just column D to be narrower, I can certainly click and drag this way, or double click to make it be so-called best fit. It's pretty apparent I wouldn't leave them in this look here. If I want all columns to be a best fit, in other words, I want each column to be wide enough to handle the widest entry, then simply click in the upper left corner, double click any boundary between column letters, and we see what's happening there. If I were working with this and adjusting column A manually, and it's too narrow, column E is too wide, and for the moment I'm doing this on purpose, some are too wide, some are too narrow, we can readjust all of them quickly, simply by clicking in the upper left corner, then double-clicking any boundary between columns. You're much less likely to want to adjust row height, but you can certainly do that in the same general way. Maybe I want these numbers to stand out a little bit more. Maybe I'm going to be printing this and I want some space between these. With these 4 rows highlighted, I'm going to click one of the row boundaries and drag downward. Now it's taller. Each row is taller, as we wish here. We can also, after doing this, possibly adjust the placement of the text within these by going to a button here for middle align. Make the data appear that way. So at different times, you've got different reasons. At any time, you can take any column, make it wider or narrower. At other times, you'll double-click for so-called best fit. Sometimes these adjustments seem to happen almost automatically. And sometimes you'll be putting in a long word or entry. Maybe this says balance of payments. Now, it looks like the column's wide enough, but if it weren't, what would happen? It spills into the other column over here because that cell's empty. Later, if we want to adjust, double-click the boundary between A and B. Does that. Take this out, press delete. Now double-click, it readjusts because that's no longer there. If you have a merge cell, you might not be familiar with how that works, but if you have a merge cell here, it essentially is ignored. If this were not merged, and I'll go to merge and center here, and unmerge it, sometimes you're in for a surprise here. If I were to say, let's make column A be a best fit, I'll double-click the boundary between A and B, and it does that. So in that case, if you didn't want to merge, but you wanted column A to adjust, you'd have to do column A manually, and then adjust the others as needed. Now, again, best fit does not mean the same width. Column H, for example, has a number over 1,000, whereas June and the other numbers here are not. Therefore, column H is going to be wider. That's just the way it is if you use best fit. If you'd like to readjust the rows here, go back and select the entire worksheet, double-click any boundary between row numbers, and they're readjusted this way. So you want to have the feeling that you've got complete control over the width of columns and the height of rows. Also note that if a column is too narrow and it has numbers in it, you will see pound signs. There will be times, too, when you see pound signs, if you zoom in, possibly using that slider bar in the lower right-hand corner, or zoom out, sometimes you'll see more or fewer of the pound signs, and that's a little bit confusing. That's just a flaw in the design of Excel. You don't worry about it too much. Focus on the particular display percent that you want, and then readjust the column widths. Let's readjust all these again. Double-click. There we are. Easy to adjust column widths and row heights. We're looking at a worksheet called Align, Wrap, Merge in our workbook 04 Formatting. And those 3 words, align, wrap, and merge, are kinds of features that you will need to use at different times. The text entries we see in column A, from A4 downward, look just fine to me and probably to you too. On the other hand, how might they look if they were aligned on the right side of the cell? In the alignment group, on the Home tab, here's right aligned. Easy to make a change, easy to reject. Text is automatically left aligned, and notice that when these cells are highlighted, even though left align isn't selected, they are aligned on the left. You possibly could center them, possibly on the right. And you might change your mind at different times. With numbers, particularly if they're used computationally, I would strongly suggest don't try and change these. Now, depending upon the format, some of these could change. And so sometimes you could be encountering a worksheet that does have alignment that you don't want. Could these be left aligned? Some of them are, some of them are not. If I got a worksheet like this, one of the first things I'd do is line these up on the right. I'd highlight them and turn off that left align button. So sometimes you have to make your own choices. For some numbers like these, you might try and center them or left align them, and it just doesn't work. So based on the format that's being used, you might or might not be able to realign certain kinds of numerical entries. Now, we can also align, but it only has relevance when we have taller rows, bottom, middle, or top. So let's create a situation where we might want to use that feature. I'm going to change the entry in cell H3 to be first half total. Now, possibly we might want to wrap this text so that it appears first half and then below it total in the same cell. And there are two ways to do this. I'm going to type first half and press Alt-Enter. That forces a line wrap, and then put in total. And as I press Enter, watch row 3 get taller. Happens like that. Now, this is in the bottom of the cell, it's in the middle or the top. Now, there's no difference here unless we made that row taller. I'm going to make row 3 taller, pointing on the boundary between 3 and 4. Now, I don't really need to do this, but I want to bring out this idea that there could be times when you're seeing data like this. With this being the only one in the row, we're probably not going to use this feature, but we could align this in the middle or align it on top. Do be aware of that. Not so much in the example here, but in other situations where you are seeing titles like this. Now, I'm going to undo some of the recent actions, Control-Z, 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 a few times here, and actually go back to here. Another way to perform wrap text, a bit longer, but it does get you around the idea that shortcuts you're not always aware of. First half, space. Now the reaction could be, I don't want to make the column wider, it's too wide. What could we do here? On the Alignment tab in the Home group, we've got a choice called Wrap Text. Just click it. Now, it doesn't always wrap the text where you want it to, but on the other hand, it gets the job done, and sometimes you might need to do this to multiple cells. So that's a use of it as well. Another feature that we need from time to time is merging. The title on this worksheet is called Sales and Profits First Half Projections. It's in cell A1, and currently it's spilling right all the way over into E1. Now we might want to center this across the data. Could we move it into C1 or D1 and hope that it's going to work there? Well, we could. But on the other hand, we might highlight these cells all the way across. Remember, the data, the text itself, is only in cell A1. But here's the choice, merge and center. That turns it into one big cell. In this worksheet right now, there is no B1, C1, D1, etc., all the way over to E1, but there is an A1, and it's a much wider cell. We can do the same thing here. Could we have done them together? I'm going to press Control-Z. We could highlight these cells like this. Now what happens here if we press Merge and Center? A pop-up message says, merging only keeps the upper left cell and discards the other value. Here's what would happen. I'll do an undo after I do this. We see that it's thrown away the other data. Just press Control-Z here. We could highlight the data this way, and then let go of the left mouse button, and using the Control key, highlight this data. We've selected two different areas using the Control key. Now we can do Merge and Center this way. As a follow-up here, but certainly not necessary, we could select this cell and maybe give it a color background. We can do some other features, of course, doing this. So we merge the cells. If you don't want to merge them anymore, come back here and unmerge the cells. So merging cells makes sense. There are even some unusual situations where you can merge cells down a column. But aligning the data, wrapping the text, these are features available here. We can also use the arrow in the lower right-hand corner to get to some of these features. Additionally, we can also come to different alignment choices here along the right-hand side. Here, we can make these be diagonal. Now, is that going to make sense in just that one cell? Probably not. But on the other hand, it might make sense right here. A faster way to get to these, Also in the alignment group, the angled text right here. Click this, change the orientation. Change it that way. Not truly necessary, but on the other hand, sometimes it gives a little bit of visual flair. Everybody at least once probably tries vertical text and usually rejects it. I know I have. At other times, maybe an alternate to this could be rotate text up. I think you recognize that much of the time these are not truly necessary, but at other times it gives it a certain look that you like. So lots of features available here, either in the alignment group here or by way of the dialog box launcher here. Some of the choices available on the alignment tab. We can give special emphasis to certain cells in Excel in a variety of different ways. Quite a few tools here in the font group. Bold, italic, underline, cell backgrounds, font colors, and there's a border feature here as well. Let's imagine that we want these numbers to stand out. These are not formulas, they are pure numbers. We want to stress that by putting a border around them. Here's a border button. Click the drop arrow, lots of choices, bottom border, top border, left border. How about a thick outside border, like this? Many times when you apply a border feature, you cannot see its effect until you click elsewhere. Let's click down here. So that makes the data stand out in a certain way. If you'd prefer a lighter color, we could go back here and choose another option. It's simply outside borders without the word thick. So a thinner look, you might say. And there are lots of other choices available too. Let's keep this data highlighted and pursue some other options. Going back to the drop arrow here, at the very bottom, we see a choice called More Borders. This takes us into the Format Cells dialog box on the Border tab. Now, we could choose different line styles here. There's a dashed line, thin line, thick line. We can apply a color at the same time. How about a bright red here? Now, the box to the right gives us a preview. We might want an outline of red, also inside cells here, with thick red lines as well too. Or how about a different line style? Maybe try these. Lots of choices here. Even diagonals, which probably wouldn't make a lot of sense here, although in some unusual situations possibly that, but not in this case. So by trying these buttons on and off here, you can begin to see what we could be doing with this. I'm going to go back to outline here and inside. So we're about to see a thick red border around every single cell in this group. See the effect of that. Maybe that's overkill. And we can highlight other cells as well too. At different times you might want to change your mind about this or simply get rid of it. Highlight the cells, come back here, and choose no border. There's even the possibility of drawing borders. Click the drop arrow. We don't have to have any particular cells highlighted right now, but draw border grid. How about draw border? Let's draw a border around these cells. Some people like this, it's a bit more visual. You can continue to do this until you press escape. Or maybe I want to draw a border grid. Click the drop arrow, draw a border grid around these cells. Once again, we'll press escape here to remove the pointer. So for special effects, apply borders, take them off at different times. It makes the data stand out in a certain way. Available on the font group in the Home tab. Excel has quite a few different ways to format numbers. We're looking at a worksheet called Numeric and a workbook called O4 Formatting. Quite a few different number types here. First of all, in column B, we see Social Security numbers. By the way, these are randomly generated. I hope we didn't put yours in there. What's wrong with these? Not exactly wrong, but what's a little bit unusual. As we use Social Security numbers, typically we see dashes in there. After the first 3 characters, and then 2 more characters, and another dash, and then the final 4. Rather than typing dashes, the person who put in the data perhaps thought, I'll get to those later. Now, ideally what you do in a situation like this is format the cells ahead of time. In fact, the entire column in this case. If you right-click a column letter, you can immediately go to Format Cells. And you wouldn't necessarily know where to find this, but on the Number tab, there is a category called Special, and there we see Social Security number. If we click OK, we now see dashes. As soon as we make this column adjustment, double-click the boundary between B and C. Now, the dashes are not truly in the data. Look in the formula bar, you don't see them. If you double-click here to edit, you don't see them. They're in the format. But why type dashes when you don't really need to? It looks like the phone numbers were pursued in the same way. Here too, why type open and close parentheses, a space, and a dash? Simply format these. Now once again, I would stress, if you're setting up a phone column to put in data, format this ahead of time, or at least after you get in one of the numbers. Here too, we could activate format cells with Control 1. It's another way to get there. Off to the right, we'll go to Special, same general location. Phone number, we can double click it too, that's a little bit faster. And we see what's happening once we readjust the column width. If we're editing here, for example, double clicking, that 901 should have been a 303. Highlight the data, 303. We're not seeing those symbols, we're not typing them, we press enter and yet we see them. Now, two commonly used features for formatting are found on the Home tab in the Number group. Now, this is a salary column. We might want to see dollar signs. Not everybody does. But let's choose dollar sign here after selecting the entire column in this case. Dollar sign. Notice that when we slide over the dollar sign button, it says Accounting Number Format. If we make the column wider, we certainly don't need to, but sometimes we might because there could be some different salary widths in there. Notice what the dollar sign does. It stays on the left side. Nothing wrong with that truly, but sometimes the alignment button here has some impact. Notice how that changes. Looks like it just changed the top seller, but the dollar signs are changing just slightly there. Now, many times if you're using numbers that have 0 pennies in them, as we see here, it would make sense not to display them. So it's not uncommon when you're using dollar signs with certain kinds of numbers to not show the decimals. Decrease them twice. So we see the effect there. And it's important to note too that by doing this we are not changing the content. If, for example, we have values in here that were 75 cents, 80 cents, this particular entry here would read 42541. Now it's not really changing the value if we were to do that, but it would change the display. And at certain times it makes sense not to show the pennies. But don't ever assume that these buttons here that increase or decrease decimals are changing content. It's simply appearance. Over here in column G, we might want to use dollar sign. We could do that. Notice the difference here, and particularly if we make the column wider, we see what's happening here with the display. Now, in both of these columns, it might make sense not to use dollar signs. Salary, perhaps it's obvious they're dollar signs, and maybe here too. So either separately or together, maybe together, we'll highlight both columns and use the comma button. The big difference here will be the absence of the dollar signs. But in other respects, the entries look pretty similar. Let's go back to dollar sign, back to comma. What's the difference? The presence of the dollar sign. So, many times for formatting, the comma in the dollar sign button makes sense. If you are using comma here too, maybe we don't want to show the pennies. Do recognize the difference here too, what happens with negatives. And that may not be your choice. In other words, they're in parentheses. This is what accounting format does. That's what comma format does. So, either one at a time or together, let's consider some other options here. If you go to the dialog box launcher in the corner here, or if you press Control 1, you'll come into Format Cells. And we've got some additional choices here. Here's Currency. Notice here that Currency gives us the option of making the negatives be either red or red in parentheses. I'm going to choose red in parentheses. Click OK. Let's see what's happening there. Now, again, pressing Control 1. We've got another choice. We've got number, we've got currency, and we've got accounting. At different times, you might want to choose one or the other. And the problem sometimes is you'll get data from other sources. What if some of the data you're getting uses currency, some is using accounting? Let's use accounting here. Okay, we see the dollar signs. Watch what happens when I use currency. I'll go back by way of the dialog box launcher, use currency, and maybe here I want to use parentheses black. Click OK, but watch the dollar sign. You see how it goes inside the parentheses. Click the dollar sign up here, it goes outside again. And again, what I'm doing here is showing you different formats. This is not designed to confuse you, but to point out their differences. By all means, pick a favorite, and I strongly recommend dollar sign and comma. I think that works for most people. But when you are getting data from other sources, it's not always in the same format as yours. And you'll have to decide one way or another which works best. But at least you do have some options. Do notice that when you selected a column like this and you're using comma format, there is space to the right, and that's to allow for the parentheses if a number is negative. Now over here, by putting a minus in front of this, of course we don't really have negative salaries, watch how the commas still line up, and the decimals would too if we had those. So I see the parentheses on the right. That's why there's spacing there. If you use number format, we can go back to the dialog box this way or by way of Control 1. If you use number format, you will not necessarily see that space on the right unless you choose the option that has parentheses. So what if we use this format? That's another option. So again, you'll have to decide which one to use, but do recognize the idea here that we have different kinds of fonts available. And here too, this list to the right, we don't need to see all of it, but I'll make column K wider. We see how the dollar signs are out here. Now, if you don't want them to be on the left side, we can highlight both of these. If you want the dollar sign next to the numbers, well then we'll use currency format. Once again, we could press Control 1 and use currency, no decimal places, click OK, and the dollar signs will be next to the number. So lots of different formats here, but we can get to them easily, initially by way of the buttons here available in the number group on the Home tab, but also by way of Control 1, where we see other options available under Format Cells. In Excel, the standard display of dates is as we see them in columns B and C. Month, day, year in the United States, 4-digit year, no leading zeros for the month or the day. If you type in an entry, for example, in cell G5, I'm simply typing 5/6, that would be May 6th/16, 2016. But as I press enter, we see what happens. And for a lot of people in the United States, this is just fine. This is what they would want. If you want to save some space and you prefer a 2-digit year, you can click the area that you're about to change, for example, column B here, and immediately go to Format Cells, either by right-clicking and choosing Format Cells or pressing Control 1. And you'll see on the Format Cells dialog box, the Number tab, Date, and quite a few options in here. And you can even create your own customized versions if you wish. Here's the same kind of date, but displayed with a 2-digit year, and again, no leading zeros. If that's clear to you, and if there's no confusion whatsoever about which century we're talking about in those years, fine, it will take up less space. You can go behind the scenes to do that. At a later time, if you're seeing this and prefer a 4-digit year, you don't necessarily have to go into that dialog box. On the Home tab, you can click the drop arrow right here that's above the other choices and choose Short Date. If you choose Long Date, I think everybody tries this maybe at least once, but maybe not so much later. Long Date looks like this, and that's probably a lot more detail than you would need most of the time. I'll undo that with Control Z. Notice something else too. If the dates are selected and you go to Format Cells, Control 1, if you then switch to Custom, now there's some fine-tuning capabilities here that are well beyond the scope of this course if we were talking more about numbers. Quite a few choices in there, and you can customize this to no end. But when it comes to dates and times, there are some simple rules for controlling this if you wish. M's and D's and Y's. If you put in 3 M's, that abbreviates the month. If you put in 4 M's, it spells out the month. So if you wanted to put in the month, and then if you wanted to put in day of the week, 4 D's would spell it out, 3 D's would abbreviate it, 2 D's would put in a day as 09 or 07. A single D will handle all kinds of dates, just the numerical part of it. So if we put in MMMM, DDDD, space, and 4 Y's, this probably is not what you would want. See what this looks like. 4 M's, 4 D's, 4 Y's. Probably not what you would want because we don't have the actual day there. You have the day of the week, but not the number. So jumping back to Format Cells again with Control 1, all kinds of variations. I think you can see this could be a time waster if you're not careful too. Make this a little bit better. Right before the 4 Y's, you could put in the D comma space. Then it would look like this. Again, that's probably a little unorthodox too, but you've got tons of choices out there. Again, a quick fix to go back to the standard if you like the standard. I'll click the drop arrow here. Again, this is on the Home tab in the number group, the drop arrow at the top here, and choose Short Date. And here we have to readjust the column if we want to keep that. Double-click the boundary between B and C. Sometimes you want to change the format for readability, or possibly you're dealing with data that travels back and forth across different countries. I think a lot of you know that month, day, year, although used in the United States, is not commonly used elsewhere. It tends to be day, month, year. Now, we're not going to change that here, but what we can do is use a keystroke shortcut. It's Control-Shift-3. It's the only keystroke shortcut for dates, and you like it or you don't. I understand it's widely used in the federal government. It does eliminate that possible doubt that you have sometimes as to which month it is. Not doubt for very long, but you have to sometimes pause and think, does 7 mean July or not? And this just eliminates that particular doubt. What some people don't like about this is the digits before the month and after sometimes can get confused. Is that 13th November of 2014? Or is it the 14th of November 2013? Well, it's the former, not the latter. That's 2014. So if you like this, but you'd like to change it, once again, you could go to Format Cells by way of Control-1 on Custom here, and you do see a preview here too if you had one cell change, but if we got them all, we won't. But we could just put in a 4-digit year. So instead of 2 Ys here, we'll add 2 more, and then we'll have this kind of display. Have to adjust the column width too. So there we see it that way. That could be a preference too, but no keystroke shortcut to get to that. If you're dealing with times, certainly one way to display the times of day would be this way. Now this is 24-hour style, widely used throughout the world, not so much in the United States, although you do see them on airline timetables, for example, and reservations and that sort of thing. A quick fix here, if you prefer to see AM, PM, and we can do it for both columns, is Control-Shift-2, and we see these choices here. Now, when you're measuring time, not AM, PM, but elapsed time, here's some actual differences between the two. We would want to keep them this way. In other words, you don't want these to be AM, PM. Now, when you write a formula like this, sometimes, in other words, if this were not here, if I type equal M2 minus L2, because this was formatted previously, it's not going to change. But if I write the formula out here, equal M2 minus L2, I get an answer like that, which would not be acceptable. So if you had answers like this, we do the same kind of thing we did with dates. Immediately go to Format Cells by way of Control-1, and here select the time category, and the other option you would use frequently is 13:30. And we see the preview above it, it says 1:19. So I think for most people who use time displays, it's either going to be the AM/PM style, or they wanted to have it displayed without AM/PM, looking like this, for example. Now, if these times were farther apart, we would cross the 12-hour boundary. Suppose, for example, the start time here on one of these here, what if it's 2:23 a.m., and maybe the end time over here was 11:52 p.m. I'll just put the P in there. Like that. That's 21 hours. That's the way we would want to see it be displayed. No AM, PM, because we're talking about a difference here. Keep in mind, too, that although you might not necessarily be using dates and times in an arithmetic or calculation kind of way, the stage is set for using the numbers that way, provided you enter the data with colons properly. And a little tip here, which we mentioned in a previous movie, if you are putting in times of day and you want to see the AM, PM displayed, you can type, for example, 4:45, space P for PM. Something like that, or space A for AM if you wish. So at different times you'll need the AM, PM, and other times you won't. Sometimes you'll need to get rid of them. Sometimes you need to add this. But it's all available by way of Format Cells on the Number tab. And getting back to dates, the same idea there. So Control-1, our shortcut for getting there, is really helpful when we're adjusting date and time formats in Excel. Excel's conditional formatting feature, found on the Home tab, is a great tool for highlighting data, making it stand out. As you use this feature, I'm clicking on the button right here on the Home tab, you'll see the description of it. But as you use this, often its various features spill out over across the worksheet. So if you're going to be dealing with data, it's best to move it slightly left of center on your screen. I'm going to be applying this perhaps to column H, column I, so I'll scroll to the right a little bit. Let's imagine that we might want these salaries to stand out in a different way. I'm selecting column H. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that every time you use conditional formatting, you'll be selecting a column, but it's common to do that. We want to change column H. This list might grow or shrink. We want a format applied based on some conditions. It could be something simple and straightforward, like highlight cell rules that are greater than. In other words, let's make salary stand out if they are greater than a certain amount. Excel already makes a suggestion here. I'm going to change it. It picks a midpoint. I'm going to pick 70,000 here. And it's already applying a feature that we see to the left. Red fill, dark text. But there are some other choices here. And if we don't like some of these, we can try some others. In other words, the bottom here, custom format. So we could make them all yellow, blue, green, put on borders, fonts, whatever. If you're in a hurry, fill is pretty obvious. I'll fill them with yellow. Click OK, click OK. So we see at a glance which compensation amounts here are above 70,000. And it is dynamic. So if this salary here gets reduced a bit to 69,000, as soon as I press enter, it would no longer be yellow. One of these down here, this becomes 71,000. It will turn yellow, and so on. You see how that works. Pretty apparent the way the feature is described. Let's go back here, though, and look at some other features. If we no longer want to use this, sometimes we just want to turn off the feature, go back to conditional formatting, and clear the rules. If we had other conditional formatting in the worksheet, we could clear those rules as well with the option Clear Rules from Entire Sheet. We simply want to clear rules from the selected cells here. Let's come back and look at some other options here. Top-bottom rules. Maybe we just want to highlight the compensation amounts that are above average. That probably wouldn't be a great thing to do here because people are of different status and the average probably is a misleading number, but you can imagine using that. Highlight the bottom 10%, highlight top 10%, and so on. Excel does all the math by analyzing the data in the selected area. A more obvious visual would be data bars, and as I slide over these, you can see what's happening over in column H. Now, you might think that by making the column wider, you could see these bars better, but that's not the case. Solid fill looks a little bit different, and because some of these colors are dark, the numbers are partially obscured, particularly on some of the darker colors. So maybe this gold here might work best. But if I make the column wider, the columns, or the bars, will grow along with the numbers. There is an option here, by the way, to not show the numbers. You could do this on the fly by making the text white, but that's probably not the best way to do it. We can go back to conditional formatting. When you want to change one of the settings, sometimes the option is manage the rules. In other words, a rule has been applied here. Let's go manage the conditional formatting rule here. And although you don't see this at first, here's a choice called edit rule. And buried in here, amongst all these different features, is an option show bar only. Click OK, and OK, and we've got that look. So you might be making a presentation of this data and people's names are on it, and maybe you don't want to reveal their exact salaries, but you want to reveal the approximate salary compared with others. Now, if you happen to slide over this, if you click on one of these, you can see this in the formula bar, so we're not throwing the data away, we're just hiding it for display reasons. Now, going back to column H, first of all, I'll scroll to the right, select column H, back to conditional formatting. If we want to bring back those numbers, and let's say we do for a bit, we'll come back and manage the rules again. Here's the rule in question right here, it's the only one. Edit rule, and uncheck the box that says show bar only. And click OK, and OK again. And if we'd like to get rid of this feature to apply a new one, mistakenly what you can do sometimes is also apply color scales on top of the bars, and that really is not what you want to do. So I'm going to clear the rules here first from these selected cells and come back again with conditional formatting and take a look at color scales. Now, what you see here initially, it might say 3 colors, 2 colors, but actually it's a continuum of colors. For example, if I make this option here, the higher salaries are red, the lower ones are green. The first button here is the reverse of that. But we're not seeing just 3 colors, although it looks like we're seeing red, yellow, and green, but we're actually seeing lighter greens in here, and green yellows, whatever they're called, oranges in here as well. So if I were to click here and press the AZ button, or ZA to sort the data, on the Data tab, like this, you see how it's very red there, but as I move downward, moving into higher salaries, see how it's getting lighter and lighter and lighter. So each one of these, you could say, is slightly different if the compensation amount is different. And we're heading into the yellows and then the green yellow and so on. That should become dark green. Now, you don't have to do this, of course, every time you're applying these colors, but it gives you some sense of how this is working. I'll press Control Z here to unsort. So that's another option. And again, that brings out the data. And here too, we have that same option if we wished, hide the salary itself, hide the actual value there, the compensation amount. Back to the Home tab, conditional formatting. And once again, I'm going to clear the rules because another choice here is a favorite of some people for sure, called icon sets. Now, you can divide the data into thirds or fourths or fifths. And by the way, if we choose 3, this doesn't mean that we're going to have an equal number of red arrows and green arrows and yellow arrows. It means the values are being analyzed, and those values in the top third value-wise are going to be green, bottom third red. So we're not going to see necessarily the same number of entries having the same arrows and so on. And there's a slight redesign from prior versions. The arrows are a little more stylized. We see some other choices here, 4 arrows, 5 arrows, and so on. And they've even given names to these. These are traffic lights, these are rimmed traffic lights, these are unrimmed, and so on. Different choices, and different icon sets. And because the so-called live preview effect that Microsoft talks about is in effect, we see what's about to happen in column H before actually making a choice. And you can see how this gives some visual weight to the data here. Here too, if you only wanted to display the relative size of a compensation amount, you might choose this option right here and do it like we did before. Back to conditional formatting, manage the rules, edit the rule, and consider in this case, show icon only, and not see those particular compensation amounts. So lots of choices here. It's dynamic, and you could use this. We could use it possibly in column I, we could use it in column F. Lots of choices here. Relatively easy to work with once you get familiar with it. And it is dynamic. If you are working with large lists like this, I think it's convenient to select the entire column because then you don't have to worry about the effect of formatting on new records that you add at the bottom. Or if there's a drastic cutback and names disappear, you're not going to be worrying about this either. So it's a great feature to bring out data. I'm going to press Control-Z a couple of times here. I think it's better in this case maybe to see these, but you'll have different approaches as to how you might want to use this feature. Conditional formatting found on the Home tab. If you work with lists of data, maybe a personnel and HR kind of list like we're seeing here, or an inventory list or a transaction list, something like that, as lists grow or shrink, you can facilitate the management of them with a feature called a table. On the Home tab, you might see Format as Table in the Styles group. Now, the description there doesn't exactly give you a rationale for using this feature. It says, quickly convert a range of cells to a table with its own style. On the Insert tab, you'll see the same feature with a much better description. Create a table to organize and analyze related data. Tables make it easy to sort, filter, and format data within a sheet. Now, the term I've used is entity. We want to treat this data as an entity. Let's convert it to a table. There are 2 keystroke shortcuts we could use, either Control-T, think of T for table, Control-L, think of L for list, or on the Insert or Home tab. I'm going to use Insert tab here. Now, before doing this, though, you want to make sure that the data you want to deal with as a unit has no empty rows in it, empty columns. One quick way to determine that is click within the data, press Control-A, and then press Control-Period 4 or 5 times. This will move the active cell around the corners of the range. Control-Period, upper left, Control-Period, upper right, again, Control-Period. Now, if you haven't seen the data in a while, is that really the last row? Scroll a little bit beyond it. Looks like it is. Control-Period a few more times, we're back up top. You don't need to do that often when you're working with data, but occasionally it's handy. So, this data is ready to be converted into a table. So click on any cell, Insert tab, Table. Excel makes an educated guess as to the extent of your data. Usually gets it right, from A1 in the upper left down to I742 lower right. Looks good. Click OK. The first obvious visual difference, banded rows, a certain look there. And notice in the ribbon, we've got a design tab, a contextual tab related to features that we might be using as we work with the table. Click outside the table, over in column K, for example, you see how that contextual tab disappears. Click back within the data, it reappears. What might catch your eye at first are table styles. We could click here, and you just needed 61 different ways to display this, didn't you? Slide over with the mouse, take a look at this, look at that. Maybe I'll just pick this one for the time being. Might change my mind later. The characteristic look here is referred to as banded rows. Notice in that contextual tab, there's there's another option called banded columns. If you'd like to use that, uncheck banded rows, check banded columns. If you like that look, fine. And the table styles that you might be considering also, at least for the moment, are showing the banded column look. Everybody probably tries this at least once. Banded rows, banded columns, not so great together. One or the other. I'll stick with the banded rows. You can give special emphasis to the first column if you wish. Usually what this means is it makes the data bold and also in some cases gives a different color background. You can do that with the last column if you wish. Either or both or none. If the filter arrows here are something you don't use that often, if you find them annoying, if they're overlapping some of your titles and you prefer that not to be the case, there's a button up here for turning off the filter. This suggests, though, that your data is being treated as a unit. So what happens if we add a new record at the bottom? I'm going to double-click the bottom edge of this cell, which is active. Double-click down to the bottom and start to type a new record. Press Tab, and immediately that row becomes part of the table. Any formulas that are here automatically get copied downward. So there's a formula here that picks up years of service based on the date, but I haven't put in the date yet. But the formula is still really doing its job. It's coming up with an answer here. I'll add another row, and it'll be a little bit more obvious because this row is going to be a darker color than the previous one. And we see what happens there. The same thing will happen on the right side of the data as well. So anytime you add data at the bottom of a table or on the right side, I'm going to add a new column here, and we're going to be calculating a new compensation amount. So I'll type new comp, abbreviate it so the column's not going to be as wide, like that. Watch what happens when I press enter. That column becomes part of the table as well. I'm going to write a formula here, equal H2 plus 2,000. Watch what happens when I press enter. Automatically it gets copied down the column, and we see a $2,000 increase for everybody. Now, here's something that you might find a little confusing. Instead of using H2, what if I actually had clicked on the cell? I'm going to click cell H2. That looks quite a bit different. Now, compensation is the range name that's automatically set up in tables for the different columns. I'll press enter here, and that gets copied all the way down the column. Any one of these says that. So when you first encounter these, it might be a little unsettling. You got to get used to that idea. If somehow that's too unusual, you could do as I did earlier, simply use the cell addresses. We also could have written this formula, by the way, with an external amount. Suppose everybody's going to get a 3.1% increase. I could have written the formula this way. Instead of plus 2,000, how about asterisk? And I'll use this cell out here. And you may or may not have reached this level of Excel, but we need to make that an absolute address by pressing F4 or manually putting in dollar signs and then plus this. So the formulas look a little weird at first, possibly. I'll press enter now, and this will be copied automatically down the column. Now, something we don't have time to go into, but it's worth noting. If you work with charts, and you've got charts where the source data is continually being added to with new information on the bottom, if you want your charts to grow automatically without having to redesign them each time, the source data for the chart can be converted into a table, and then any chart based on it will automatically grow as you add new records to the bottom. So that's something worth considering for those of you who work with charts and want to see them presented in a dynamic way. A couple other features here available on the Design tab as well. We can add a total row. This is going to be on the bottom. And right away you might be thinking, well, what happens if we want to add a new record? So I've got a total here on the right, and that, by choosing the down arrow, could be an average. It could be a max or a min. I think total, a sum here makes sense. Well, we could also take that information and drag it leftward, possibly into these columns here. Now, probably want a total there, but for job rating, I'd probably want an average. So I'll click the drop arrow, choose average. Average job rating. And we could add a decimal there if we wanted to. For the moment, don't worry about that. So the question comes up, what happens if we want to add a new record? Turn off the total row. We'll put in a new name out here. Fill in the other data, maybe now or later, but then go back to the Design tab and simply bring back the total row. And if we had added some numbers here, they would be included in the new total. So these are automatically set up. So you might want to work with a total row. It makes it handy to get to that data there. Another feature here too, you can also use what are called slicers. Now, slicers were introduced in Excel 2010, but only for pivot tables. Starting in Excel 2013 and thereafter, you can now use slicers on tables. Now, this is not a pivot table, but it's a table. Slicers allow you to filter data in a more dynamic way. Let's say we want to add slicers here to have control over the display of departments, possibly status as well too. Now, you don't necessarily have to know much about filtering to do this, but on the Design tab here, we do have the ability to insert a slicer. I'm going to put a slicer in for department and maybe for status, and click OK. And because these take up a considerable amount of screen space, I'm going to move these around a little bit and make this a bit smaller so we can see it there, like that. And you have to experiment with that a little bit. We can also change its color and all that sort of thing. Department, we've got quite a few of these, and we might want to display these in 3 columns. We've got about 20 of them out there. Many times the problem with slicers that you encounter is that they take up more screen space than you might like. So I'm going to leave these right here. Now, as we scroll leftward to see the departments, we might have to, so we can see things a little bit better, zoom back a little bit. I think you can still see that reasonably. But here's the idea, and we still might have to make that slicer panel for departments a bit wider there. There we go. So, let's start first with the idea. In our list there, we only want to see full-time people. Now again, if you're adept with filtering, you would know how to do that. But with Slicer, all we got to do is check full-time. And our list is only showing full-time people. Lower left corner says we've got 393 out of 744 records. If we would also like to include half-time people here, we'll use the Control key as we click half-time. There we are. To not filter at all by status, clear the filter. Now, for the moment, I'm going to expand our slicer list up here. Suppose we just want to view people in environmental, right here. And that full name there, I can't even say. There it is, environmental compliance. Our other environmental group is right here. We'll hold down Control and click that. So now we're seeing 23 records. So we've got some other features here as well, too. Let's say we want to use the professional training group right here. Do we have another training group in there? Yeah, another one down here just called training, control, so on. In other words, we are controlling, by way of a slicer, the filtering. In other words, we're just looking at the records that we want to by way of these slicers. And you can imagine how we could also use other fields here too. The problem at times, as we're seeing here, it gets a bit crowded. If we also wanted the ability here to just view people based on their benefit package combinations, we could do that too, or which building they work in. So let's add one more just for the sake of argument here to show how that would work. So clicking within the table, back on the Design tab there, let's insert a slicer, and this time we'll add a slicer for building. And there's building. So let's just look at people in the main building. There they are. Now the other filters are in place too. Let's clear the department filter and clear the status filter as well. So we've got 199 people in the so-called main building, that sort of thing. So you can begin to see some real advantages here. Remember, you cannot use these slicers in other kinds of lists. Well, you can in pivot tables, but you can't use them in any other kind of list that has not been converted to a table. So there are lots of features regarding tables that you're going to find beneficial. So at least consider the option. You might want to experiment with it on a smaller list, get the feel of it, and then decide how you're going to work with it. But I see more and more people using this feature. It was introduced in Excel 2007. Again, it's referred to as a table. We're on a worksheet called Shapes, and there are actually no shapes on this worksheet right now. But we can add some visual flair, we can add a company logo, we can add a picture, either from an online source or from a file that we have, in a variety of different ways. Most of these features begin on the Insert tab. There's also a feature here called Smart Art. Possibly your display of this portion of the screen might look a little different depending upon the resolution that you're using, so possibly this feature here, referred to as Shapes, might be larger. You might even see the word Shapes next to it. I'm going to click this, and it reveals tons of options here. These shapes that we see, if they encompass space, could also include text. And we see some familiar images here, like a smiley face here. And we see octagons, hexagons, pentagons, different size arrows here, equations, tons of choices, stars and banners, that sort of thing. If you'd like to draw one of these and then possibly add text, simply click it. For example, here's a rectangle up top, click it. And I'll simply drag this by clicking and dragging this way. If you want this to be a perfect square, by the way, hold down the Shift key and be sure to let go of the mouse first. Now that may or may not be necessary, but I'll let go of the mouse here so it's a perfect square. If you'd like to draw a circle, then pick the oval. Notice that after you've drawn one image, the Format tab is active, and we can make some changes here to the shape we've just drawn. And also off to the left we see some other shapes. So here's an oval right here. I'll click that. And that too could be an oval, a wide oval, tall oval. If you want it to be a perfect circle, we hold down the Shift key. And that's true of other shapes as well. If we want to use a hexagon, for example, I used that not so long ago, so it's up in that little menu to the left. Choose hexagon, drag that. It could be very wide, it could be very tall, that sort of thing. Hold down Shift to make it a perfect shape. Maybe I don't care this time, I want it to be wide. Certain shapes, you'll see a yellow circle here, and you can drag that. And it's hard to describe that in a coherent sentence, but as you work with it, you see what's happening. This is approaching a diamond, or going the other way, it's approaching a rectangle. I might want to use that as a title. Now, any one of these can contain text. All you've got to do is click it, and maybe this is the annual report, so I'll type annual report or semi-annual report. That might or might not look okay. I can make this wider, maybe it'll look better that way. And then go to the Home tab and use some of those familiar features. Let's align this in the center, also in the middle. Let's use bold print. Here's a bigger font. All these kinds of things that you might want to consider using. Make it italic. How about a different font color there? Not so good, possibly. Maybe that's better, and so on, all kinds of features. And remember, there's a contextual format tab available too. Maybe blue's not your favorite for this. Use on one of these, possibly. How about that one? If we want this to be a title, we can insert a new row above row 1. Simply using that. Maybe move this up here. Simply drag that, and maybe make it a little bit wider. That way, possibly. Make row 1 taller. Now, I think you can recognize this could be a real time waster, and if you're real picky about these things, this might take up a lot more time than you really need. And I wouldn't say that's the greatest title ever, but I think you get the idea. Something to experiment with, possibly something to use. Bigger font here might help at this point. Something like that. An attention getter. Sometimes you want to highlight certain data. Maybe this number is unusually high, and you want to congratulate Jan, who's the sales manager, for this particular number. We could go back to Insert. Possibly on shapes here, choose an oval, that would make sense. Surround this number. Now when we do this, it looks like it's hiding it, and it actually is. But then we can go to the Format tab here, Shape Fill. How about No Fill? Looking pretty good that way. If you want an arrow associated with it, here's an arrow over here. If it's not in the small panel here, we could scroll downward to see these all over again. There's an arrow. Let's draw an arrow to that. Maybe we'll drag this box up here. Put it right there. Change that box so it's got a border. Just click in here and say, great job, Jam. That sort of thing. And again, reconsider the shape and width and all that sort of thing. You can even make the arrow go behind the box too. Don't necessarily do that. Bring forward, send backward, etc. Some choices up here when the shapes are overlapping. So you can begin to see all kinds of features here. I'll move this out of the way and actually just get rid of it. Delete, that sort of thing. There's smiley face in there too. There's some unusual stars and banners. And going back to Insert here, we can also add a picture. Now, shipping with this course are some pictures in the Chapter 4 exercise files. Move this over a little bit. This is a sporting goods company. Let's imagine putting their logo out there. Let's just double-click this, or click and then Insert. That's there. Let's say we'll move this over here. Maybe change this title a bit by moving it this way and dragging this upward and shrinking it. You want to be real careful with logos. You want to make sure you're not changing the proportion of height to width. And anytime you have any of these objects, if you'd like to make it larger or smaller without changing that ratio of height to width, then drag from one of the corners, maybe something like that. And we can make this a little bit wider, possibly. So something you have to experiment with, and you can imagine, again, spending a lot of time doing some of these. Anytime you do create a shape, for example, here's that rectangle over here. If you want to make it larger or smaller, you can drag any of those 8 handles any way you wish. When you're dragging a corner, you could drag it to be taller and wider and all that, but if you want to keep the same ratio of height to width, hold down the Shift key. And that means you can only make it larger or smaller while maintaining that ratio of height to width. And going back to pictures, if we go back to Insert here, I'm going to put in the picture of these sneakers right here. Double click. On these two, you probably don't want to drag the side or top handles. That would make these quite a bit different looking. So I'm going to undo that with Control Z. Here too, make that a little bit smaller, possibly drag from the corner. And here, you don't have to hold down the Shift key. It automatically keeps that ratio of height to width. So you can imagine different items that you want to add here by way of these pictures. You can also go online, back to the Insert tab here, Online Pictures. I need a car here, for example. And we'll get lots of choices here. More choices than possibly had thought possible. Here's one right here. And that's off to the right here, didn't see it first. It's quite large, so I'll make that smaller. There we are. And way too large for my purposes, but again, for different reasons. Now this company that deals in sporting goods maybe is having a contest and this is the prize, and maybe they want to put that out there and so on. You can imagine all kinds of reasons for wanting to add these. So you can get to online pictures, you can get to pictures on files. You can also add some other features by way of what's called Smart Art. Now this would take us all day and longer to explore all the features. Once again, the icon on your screen could be larger. It tends to be under or near shapes. Insert a Smart Art graphic. I'm going to click this. Tons of choices. Over 200, believe it or not. Here's one that you might be familiar with. Some various organization charts. Now I'm not going to do too much with this, but just point out, if you choose one of these, I'll choose the basic one here. Do notice that you get a preview to the right as to how these might look. Just pick the first one here. Either double click it or haven't clicked it, click OK. Now without going too far with this, I'll first shrink it and just point out, I'll click where it says text here and type in CEO. And click right here. Now this is going to be the general counsel, so I'll abbreviate that maybe. Notice how the size of the text shrinks a little bit. And down here is the IT manager. And down here is the sales manager. And that's about all the typing I want to do. Again, notice how the text will readjust here. If I spelled out manager, see what it's doing automatically. And on one of these, the sales manager has a few persons working for him or her. I could right click here and add a shape. And I could add a shape after or below. If I add below, this happens. If I click back here and do it again, right click, add shape below. Two people that work for the sales manager, and we could fill in those. You can easily build on these, and as soon as you do have a few of these done, you'll discover there's a design tab and a format tab, and again, way too many choices maybe. It just depends upon how busy you are and how important this is, but you can imagine exploring some of these. Again, check these out. Insert tab, Smart Art, and not just the hierarchical ones, but others as well. Here, if you click all, you'll see all of them, and it just goes on and on and on. Remember Venn diagrams? You may remember that from out of the past possibly, or maybe you use them now. Here's some cycle charts, all kinds of possibilities, all under the heading Smart Art Graphic. So we've got lots of tools here available in the Insert tab to add, as we saw here, something like an organization chart. We can gather images from online sources or from files. We can create shapes, put in text, add titles, bring in logos, all kinds of options available. And sometimes these are really important to make a drab report look a lot more interesting.